So in this segment, we'll continue on to the female reproductive system. Now, the functions of the female reproductive systems are similar to the ones of the male reproductive system in that we have to produce functional gametes. In this case, it will be the oocytes. And of course, we also have to produce sex hormones that will support the reproductive system and also the development of an individual should we have the union of a spermatozoa and an oocyte. And so once that happens, then unlike the male reproductive system, which stops after producing the gametes and then delivering them, then the female reproductive system is going to be responsible for the gestation of this individual. So first we will have the union of the spermatozoa and the oocyte, which takes place within the female reproductive system. That will form a zygote, and after several rounds of cell divisions, we'll have a fetus and then an embryo. And then after about 9 months of development, we should have a newborn infant. Now, after the infant is born, we also have to have a way to feed it. And so while the organs of the female reproductive system proper are these, the ovaries, uterine tubes, uterus, vagina, and external genitalia, we will also be considering breasts in this chapter as well, because this certainly was, before we had infant formula and bottles, was the only way to feed the babies. So we'll be considering all of these within the female reproductive system, and we will start with the actual gonads, which will be our ovaries that produce the gametes, and then all the other structures. All right, so here is a sagittal view through the pelvis. And here we can see the ovary, which is the gonad, and there's one on either side. So we're going to have 2 ovaries that will produce gametes, and actually what we will come to find out is all the oocytes that a female has will be there at birth. They will have already been created before birth in utero. However, it is the maturation of these oocytes that's going to take place in the ovary once this person hits puberty and begins to have the cycles, the ovarian and uterine cycles, that could lead possibly to a potential fertilization. So we have the ovary, which is first produced all the oocytes before birth, and now is going to be the site where they mature. And then once during a cycle, it will be released. One oocyte typically will be released. So since we consider the cycle of the ovary and the uterus, which are tightly linked, and this is what's considered the monthly cycle, can vary greatly from individual to individual, but the average is 28 days. So everything that we'll be discussing in this chapter will be based on a 28-day cycle. So once every 28 days, the ovary will release an oocyte. And in some cases, it will release 2. In cases where people have undergone treatment for fertility, sometimes it can be more than that. But typically, it's 1 to 2, usually only 1. And the ovaries will actually alternate on a monthly basis. So 1 month it'll be 1 oocyte that's released from 1 ovary. The next month it's typically the other ovary that releases an oocyte. So the way the oocyte will get to the uterus is going to be through this uterine tube, which is also known as the fallopian tube, or sometimes you hear it called the ooduct. And it will provide a passageway for the oocyte. Now typically, if the oocyte will be fertilized, that is, it meets a spermatozoa and becomes a zygote, that process will happen somewhere around in here. And then that fertilized oocyte will then come down and implant into the uterus. Now we will see that the oviduct here has these little finger-like projections called fimbriae, which means fingers. And while these are not physically attached to the ovary, they're very close. And they will kind of wave the oocyte towards the ooduct, or the oviduct, I should say. And then there will be cilia inside the oviduct that will sweep the egg towards the uterus. And regardless or not whether fertilization takes place, this process will happen on a monthly basis. So once every 28 days, an oocyte will be produced. It will travel down into the uterus. If it is not fertilized, it will simply be expelled. But if it is fertilized, then it will implant, and the uterus is where gestation will take place. So the uterus is quite important for having kids, because if you didn't have it, well, you wouldn't have a place for gestation to take place. So the uterus is this muscular organ that's mostly composed of what we call the myometrium, and that's this muscular smooth muscle part right here. It's covered with the peritoneum, so in females the uterus is an intraperitoneal organ. And we also have this endometrium, which is a very small percentage of the uterus, and it makes up the lining. And this is what thins and thickens on a monthly basis, and it's composed mostly of blood vessels and glands and such things. We have the serosa, which is the peritoneum, that cover the uterus, and it will double back before covering the top surface of the bladder as well. So the serosa, or the peritoneum in this case, is going to make this little pouch between the uterus and the bladder, and this is called the vesicouterine pouch, and that's this little space right here. Of course, we have the bladder and the urethra, which in females is not part of the reproductive system. In males, as we know, the urethra is going to share roles. It's going to be both part of the urinary system and the reproductive system, but in the females, this is not the case. The urethra plays no part in the reproductive system at all. So we'll see that the passageway that leads from the uterus to the outside world is going to be the vagina, and this is the canal through which the baby will be born. Then we have the external genitalia here, so that will be consisting of the labia, which means lips, and the clitoris. And the clitoris is actually an extensive structure. They can only show part of it here, but if you look at it in 3D, it's quite extensive. And it has a very similar role in that it will have erectile tissues in it, so it has a similar role to the corpora cavernosa and corpus spongiosum of the penis in that it has erectile tissue in it. All right, then we have this labium minus and labium majus. This is the singular, since we're just showing one half of it here. The plural is labia. All right, let's look towards the back here, and we can see another feature of the uterus called the cervix. And the cervix literally means neck, and it's the part that projects down into the vagina. And so here's the vagina, and you can see its proximity to the rectum here. So the rectum is right next to the area where the uterus joins the vagina. And then you have these little areas where the neck projects down into the vagina. We call this area here the fornix. And as you recall, we've seen structures before with the name fornix, and this just means vault. So we have this vault-like structure where the neck of the uterus, or the cervix of the uterus, projects down into the vagina. All right, so we've got several things that will support the reproductive organs of the female, and we have one thing called the broad ligament, which in reality is a mesentery. And the mesentery, this mesentery called the broad ligament, has several parts to it, including the mesovarium, which we'll talk about in a second, and another part of it called the mesosalpinx. And we'll see these, and they will enclose the uterine tubes and part of the uterus. So they will actually wrap around the uterine tubes and hold everything in place. So we will see the broad ligament in just a moment, and we'll see some other ligaments that will help hold things in place. So for example, we'll have an ovarian ligament that will attach the ovary to the uterus, and we'll also have a suspensory ligament, which is a ligament that suspends or attaches to the ovary and connects it to the body wall. All right, so here is the broad ligament. And the broad ligament is this large ligament. You can see that it's basically covering the uterus, covers the ovaries, covers the uterine tubes. Here we have the ovarian ligament that's holding the ovary to the uterus. We have the suspensory ligament here, which is going to hold the uterus to the body wall. And not the uterus, the ovary to the body wall. And like any mesentery, the broad ligament, and this part would be the mesovarium here, we'll look at that in just a second, provides a passageway for blood vessels. So we talked a little bit about the oviduct last time. We're going to see that we have our fimbriae, which are finger-like projections. These don't actually contact the ovary, but are very close to it, and they will be what guide the oocyte when it's released into the uterine tube. And the very first part of the uterine tube is called the infundibulum, and we have seen this term before. This means funnel. So the fimbriae funnel the oocyte into the infundibulum, which is the funnel. All right, so then we have a couple of other openings at the Outside of the cervix, where it projects into the vagina, there's the external os, which is an external opening, or literally mouth, so external opening. There will be an internal os that we'll see a little bit later when we look inside the uterus. Now, when we look at the vagina, we see that the vaginal wall has rugae, just like in the stomach. And this is to provide for the distensibility of this organ should there ever be childbirth, because this organ is going to have to distend to let the baby through. All right, here's the other side here. They've retracted away, or retracted the oviduct away so that you can see the mesovarium here. And this is the part of the broad ligament that is holding the ovary sort of to the oviduct. And here we see it in sort of a transverse section, if you will. So we can look at the parts of the mesentery here. Here we have the broad ligament where it turns and folds out a little bit to contact the ovary. We have what's called the mesovarium, and then this part that extends from here toward the uterine tube, or I should say extends from the junction of the mesovarium and the broad ligament up to the uterine tube. That is called the mesosalpinx. And this is all one big mesentery. You can see the blood vessels inside here. And that will pretty much contain the entire female reproductive system, or the internal part of it, and sort of help hold everything in place. Now let's look at the ovary itself. So the ovary's job, of course, is to promote the maturation of oocytes. And you're born with as many oocytes as you're ever going to have in your life, so about 2 million. And interestingly, by the time you reach puberty, that number will have been greatly reduced through a process that we call atresia. But we'll talk about that in just a moment. Suffice it to say that the ovary starts off with these things called primordial follicles, and these have what we call primary oocytes within them. And the primordial follicles are clustered together in these areas called egg nests. And then once some of these will start to mature after puberty, once puberty hits and then the ovarian cycle begins, we will see that some of these primordial follicles will be selected for further maturation. And then we'll have a primary follicle that will then develop into a secondary follicle, which becomes the tertiary follicle, which is also known as a mature Graafian follicle. And then that's going to be about the first half of what we call the ovarian cycle. At this point, the oocyte is ready, so it will be expelled. And then what was the follicle will then involute and become the corpus luteum. And after ovulation, we will move past the first half of the ovarian cycle, which is called the follicular cycle, which is all about the development and maturation of one of these follicles. Once the oocyte is expelled, then the follicle will take on a new job. It will involute and will have the production of a hormone called progesterone. And the progesterone is produced from cholesterol. It's a steroid hormone. So the corpus luteum gets its name because it is a yellow body. You will also hear it called the yellow body or luteal body, which just means it's a yellow body because it's full of cholesterol, which is kind of a fatty thing. So it's going to be yellow inside. And while this thing is making progesterone, it's called the corpus luteum, but after a while, if there's no fertilization, well, then the second half, the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle, will come to an end, and that luteal body will involute and become the corpus albicans, or the white body, and basically it's just scar tissue. So that just means that that particular ovarian cycle is over. So let's look at the structure of the ovary a little bit. So we've got these layers. We've got the outermost layer, that is the serosa. And early anatomists really didn't know what they were talking about. They called it the germinal epithelium. And that's really a misnomer, because it's not where we have the maturation of the oocyte. It is not the germinal epithelium. It's just simply the serosa that covers it. Underneath that, we have the tunica albuginea, just like we saw covering the testis. We had one of the layers of the testis was the tunica albuginea. Then we have inside the ovary what are called stroma, and that's our layers. So we have a cortex, which is the outer layer, and that is where the maturation of the follicles happens. And then we have an inner medulla. So terms we've all seen before. All right, so as we know, we've got to promote the maturation of the female gametes, the oocytes, once a cycle. The ovaries will also create sex hormones, so estrogens and progestins. We will also be secreting inhibin, just like we had in the male system, and that will tone down the production of estrogens and also the production of, or I should say, of FSH, because FSH, as you recall in the male, promotes the maturation of sperm. Well, in the female, it promotes the maturation of the oocyte and the follicle within which it develops. And that is where FSH got its name, from follicle stimulating hormone. And it was first discovered in the female, and it wasn't known what the substance was in the male, so they called it something else. And then when they looked at the structure of it, they realized, hey, it's the same hormone. So really, a lot of the hormones that are at play in the female reproductive system are also the same ones in the male reproductive system. But when and how they're secreted, or I should say the timing of them, is different. And that's really what's going to make this very different, the major differences between the two reproductive systems in terms of how the hormones play out. So we've already talked about the support. We've talked about the mesovarian and the ovarian ligament. So I'm going to skip through that slide. We've already talked about this part. We've talked about the visceral peritoneum of the ovary, which is the part that's right next to it. This is what they erroneously first called the germinal epithelium. And then right under that, we're going to have our tunica albuginea. And the stroma are the layers inside. We've already gone over that. Now, oogenesis is the process of maturation of the oocyte. So basically, between fetal development, 3rd and 7th months, we're going to have primary oocytes. Now, these, we originally had what we call an oogonium. An oogonium, just like a spermatogonium, is going to produce primary oocytes. And primary oocytes are going also to have to go through the same reductive division, that is, reducing from 43 or 46 chromosomes down to 23 chromosomes. So the primary oocytes are going to undergo meiosis, but they're going to stop in the middle of meiosis, and they're going to stay that way until puberty. Now, there are 2 phases of meiosis. I'm not going to get into those into detail. That's really the subject for another course. But suffice it to say, they're sort of in suspended animation in meiosis. And so basically, once you are born, a female is born, then you're going to have about 2 million of these primordial follicles at birth. Each one has a primary oocyte. However, there's a process called atresia that is always at work, that some of these follicles are dying off, or they're just basically disappearing. And so by the time the person hits puberty, they'll only have about 400,000 primordial follicles. But nevertheless, that's more than enough to get one through one's entire lifetime, because probably by the end of the person's childbearing years, they only will have probably released about 500 oocytes. So, as we've said, we have our primary, or I should say the creation of the primary oocytes in utero. And then those oocytes will remain in the suspended animation until puberty. And then we have the actual maturation of an oocyte once a cycle. So basically at puberty, we're going to have some follicle stimulating hormone that's going to rise, and then that's going to start the ovarian cycle. And then from then on, we're going to have this interplay of hormones, the cycling of hormones, that is going to set the pace for the ovarian cycle. And in turn, the ovarian cycle will set the pace for the uterine cycle. And as you remember, our hypothalamus and pituitary glands are going to be secreting gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, follicle-stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. And we will see that we have feedback loops between the gonads and the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, just as we did in the male. However, the timing and the amounts of these hormones will differ. All right, so one of the things that happens during meiosis, and you probably all heard of something called polar bodies. When the oocyte, the primary oocyte divides, it's going to divide unevenly. So we didn't really go too much into the development of sperm, but each meiosis, basically, you're going to end up with 4 sperm, 4 functional sperm. With females, you're only going to have 1 oocyte. And you'll have the rest are called polar bodies. And these are little things without cytoplasm, and they just disintegrate. So once we have gone through the process first of finishing our primary, or I should say meiosis 1, we're going to go into something called meiosis 2, and that will be when we have our secondary oocyte. So we're going to get into meiosis 2 at this point, but we're going to stop in the middle of it and be in suspended animation once again. And meiosis will not ever be completed in the oocyte unless it's fertilized. So this is an important point. So the oocyte, the secondary oocyte, will also be in suspended animation, if you will, in this second half of meiosis, or meiosis 2. And we will end up having 1 ovum, and that, what we call a secondary oocyte, is the one that will be released from the mature Graafian follicle or tertiary follicle. And only upon fertilization is meiosis actually completed. All right, so we have the ovarian cycle that we already talked about. So we have the follicular phase. That is the maturation of the follicle. And that will be stimulated by follicle stimulating hormone released from the anterior pituitary gland. You also know that we're going to have gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus that's going to oversee all of this. Then we're going to have the luteal phase, and that's going to be the post-ovulatory phase. That is after the tertiary follicle has released the secondary oocyte, and at that point it involutes and becomes the corpus luteum. And then we have the luteal phase, post-ovulation. And this is when it starts producing progesterone. Now, interestingly, we're going to have a burst of something called luteinizing hormone. And that is going to trigger the release of our secondary oocyte from our tertiary follicle.